Hello and welcome everyone to this presentation on the 19th Amendment, Changing Lives Then and Now. My name is Kira Weber. I'm the chair of the Women in Law Committee for the South Dakota Bar. On behalf of the Women in Law, Diversity, Inclusion, and House Council committees, thank you so much for celebrating the 19th Amendment with us today. We are so lucky and honored to have Professor Rozum and District Court Judge Schreier with us today. I'm going to say a little bit about each of them, and then I will hand it over to our presenters. Professor Rozum is the co-editor of Equality at the Ballot Box, Votes for Women on the Northern Great Plains, published by South Dakota Historical Society Press in 2019. The volume includes her article, Citizenship, Civilization, and Property, the 1890 South Dakota Vote on Women's Suffrage and Indian Suffrage. She is the author of Grasslands Grown, Creating Place on the U.S. Northern Plains and Canadian Plains, forthcoming in 2021 from the University of Nebraska Press. Rozum is Associate Professor and Ronald R. Nelson Chair of Great Plains and South Dakota History at the University of South Dakota, where she teaches histories of South Dakota, the Great Plains, and the American West, and modern women's history. Judge Schreier received her Juris Doctorate degree from St. Louis University School of Law. Then she went on to clerk for South Dakota Supreme Court Justice Francis Dunn. After practicing for 11 years with Hagen, Wilka, Schreier, and Archer PC, she became the first woman to serve as U.S. Attorney for the District of South Dakota, where she served as the chair of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee, chair of the Juvenile Justice Subcommittee, and served as a member of the Tribal Relations Subcommittee. Judge Schreier was the first woman to serve as the federal district judge in South Dakota, serving first in Rapid City and now in Sioux Falls. Thank you so much for your time, and without any further delay, I'll hand it over to Professor Rozum.
Okay, I'm going to initiate a screen share because I have a PowerPoint presentation, and then I will get started. Okay, is everybody see my PowerPoint? Good, all right. I just want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you. I wish that we could have met in June to speak, but I'm really happy to speak with you today. I want to start by thanking the South Dakota Historical Society Press. The material that I'm going to present to you comes from my work for this volume, curating articles and editing pieces for the volume. A lot of times we run out of time at the end, so I just want to thank some of my sources here, particularly Lori Ann Lallam, who co-edited the book with me, and Jennifer Helton for information on Wyoming, Barbara Handy Marcello for information on North Dakota, Jennifer Hill and Cody Dodge Ewart for information on Montana, and Amy McKinney for a nice article on the ratification on the Northern Great Plains. And I also, you probably are all well aware that tomorrow is the anniversary of the 36th state ratifying the 19th Amendment, allowing it to be added to our US Constitution. And I've been involved this year with an organization sponsored by the South Dakota Historical Society Foundation called Her Vote, Her Voice. And you should go to their website or Facebook to see what other kinds of activities you can get involved in, particularly this week coming ahead. So without further ado, the table I have here I'm going to use to show you in a general way how the different states and territories interacted with their legislatures on the issue of suffrage in a kind of comparative way. This is a brief section. Really, the first time women's suffrage entered a territorial legislature on the Northern Great Plains was in Dakota Territory in the 1868-69 session. It did not pass. So of course that means that Wyoming became the first place anywhere under US jurisdiction to grant women the right to vote. And that happened in 1869, December 10th, 1869. Over the 70s and 80s, Dakota Territory saw multiple attempts. I'm not going to talk about them, everywhere, including an attempt in 1874 by a Minnesota senator to introduce a bill in the US Congress to divide the Dakotas and make the Northern Territory the state of Pembina and it would come in with suffrage. Of course, that failed. The best chance that probably northern Great Plains states had to pass women's suffrage came when they were creating constitutions so that they could enter the Union as states. Wyoming, of course, came in as a suffrage state, and you'll notice that the purple indicates when they actually adopted women's suffrage. Montana considered but rejected women's suffrage. They also considered allowing the legislature to decide women's suffrage without submitting it to the people. That failed. South Dakota, of course, mandated that women's suffrage be voted on in the first post-statehood election. And North Dakota basically decided that it added some language that it seemed as if it opened up the possibility at some point in the future, without specifying, that the state could adopt women's suffrage and vote on it. Now, I'm not going to talk about South Dakota suffrage because Judge Schreier is going to do that. Only wanted to show you here so you can get a comparison of the different states that I'm talking about. Montana actually won the first time it submitted women's suffrage to the statewide electorate. It's just in 1914. It's just that it took so long for them to get it through the state legislature. The odd year kind of tells the tale on those 1893, 1895, 97 blocks. Those are years where the suffragists and their supporters tried to get it through the legislature, but it failed to pass. Unlike, and you see in the South Dakota column, you've got those even years. That means that we actually voted on suffrage there. North Dakotans also, I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, North Dakotans also had very few opportunities to vote on women's suffrage on a popular level, and there's reasons for that. Now, there were women's suffrage advocates in the state. They were, in particular, were associated with a women's Christian temperance union and were interested in prohibition. North Dakota came in with prohibition and stayed a prohibition state until the 1930s. But women always attended the state legislature to make sure that no one was going to resubmit prohibition to the population because they wanted to protect it. And they also supported women's Christian temperance union advocates, long supported women's suffrage. They were some of the first suffrage organizations on the plains. Actually, women in North Dakota had to wait until the 19th Amendment before they had full suffrage rights. They did receive partial suffrage in 1917 when the Nonpartisan League, kind of farmers endorsement group, they would endorse candidates that supported pro-farmer programs. When this league-inspired group came to power in North Dakota, they did go ahead and pass partial suffrage, granting women the right to vote in presidential elections and in municipal and some county level jobs. In other words, they could not vote for governor or legislators because that had to do with provisions in the Constitution that they could not get around. For the remaining part of my time, I'm going to speak about a few of the incidents and campaigns on the Northern Great Plains. Of course, starting with Wyoming, the first territory to grant women suffrage on December 10th, 1869. Now, Jennifer Helton argues that basically women's suffrage was part of the same trajectory towards equality that freed the slaves. And she says this Wyoming and suffrage in Wyoming came about as a part of a radical Republican vision related to the Civil War. It's deeply tied to the earliest suffragists who were committed to abolition of slavery and thinking about human rights and equality for all. Now, this is a picture of James Ashley, a radical Republican from Ohio who is very interested in it, introduced one of the first Wyoming bills. And in his bill, we get an early version of the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. By the time Wyoming is created in a territorial act, it includes almost word for word the 15th Amendment language stating that, quote, the right of suffrage or to hold office on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude of any resident in the territory shall be prohibited. And this is fully 1 year before the 15th Amendment is adopted to the US Constitution, showing how this Republican vision was trying to secure the West for this vision. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that once it became a territory, it's up to Congress to appoint the officials. And they appointed a slate of Republican politicians who would oversee the setup of Wyoming Territory, including John Allen Campbell, who was appointed by Republican Ulysses Grant. Campbell, too, is a Republican. He's a Civil War veteran. He had worked in Virginia setting up voting rights precincts to ensure that African-American men could vote, and helped investigate the KKK. However, in Wyoming, most of the population were Democrats. The first territorial legislature was full of Democrats. But in the spirit of the day, there was a lot of reform-minded legislation passed. Equal pay for teachers, for example, for men and women teachers, work on women's property rights and divorce rights, and allowing women to keep their income and to participate in business. So there was a lot of this reform-minded legislation passed. And the man, however, it wasn't all about this Republican radical vision of equality coming out of the Civil War. The man who introduced it was a Virginian Southern Democrat, and his reasoning was very kind of racist in the sense that he thought if African-American men voted, we needed to have white women vote to overrule them. So you had a mix of things, but Jennifer Helton argues that it's a social movement, that the discussion and the culture of the Civil War and the debates coming out of it are really responsible for suffrage in Wyoming. And just a quick note, James Ashley, he became the governor of Montana, and Eastern suffragists were actually hoping that Montana would follow suit too, but he was just there a short time. Now this is a picture of Elizabeth Preston Anderson, who was a WCCU president from 1893 to the 1930s for the state of North Dakota. And I titled this slide, Expunged, the case of the missing 1893 North Dakota women's suffrage bill, because the only reason we know about it is because women recorded the events that happened. After all of these events, just as the Expunged suggests, the state legislature of North Dakota voted to expunge from the record all the dealings that had happened. And it's a really interesting story. And I think it suggests more of a Plains context, a settler society context that is helping to create, that's far different, removed from that Civil War context that I just talked about. So here's in brief what happened. A independent or populist party senator in North Dakota introduced a bill to grant full women to suffrage. It passed the Senate. It went to the House. It actually passed the House, which apparently wasn't supposed to happen. But so the Speaker of the House refused to sign it, the legislation. Governor Shortridge in North Dakota, who was also an independent person or populist party member, wanted to sign the bill. So here it's passed the whole legislature. The governor wants to sign it. And he said, well, I can sign it. It doesn't matter if the Speaker of the House signs it. Anyway, in the midst of this, it goes missing, the bill. Apparently, the political bosses of North Dakota, basically supporting the railroad interests, stationed men outside his door to try to intersect it if it came to the governor's door. This speaks to a little bit of corruption, I guess, in the North Dakota legislature. Finally, the postmaster of the Senate was ordered to hide it under a floor mat. and which he did, but a janitor found it and returned it to the Senate. Anyway, and then this was the last day of the legislature, and finally it was returned to the House, where the Senate thought the Speaker of the House would sign it, but instead they voted to expunge the record, which is traced by these women temperance activists, what happened there. One of the things that's interesting there is it shows a politics where really the main player was the railroad interests. The railroad interests controlled North Dakota politics, the Northern Pacific Railroad. And North Dakota was also a very prohibitionist state. And what happened was they cared more about prohibition than railroad legislation. So the political boss tried to triangulate these issues and tried to keep the idea that prohibition might go back to the people at play in order to protect railroad interests, because those interested in prohibition, if they had women's suffrage voting, it was assumed that they would support prohibition. So if women's suffrage passed, it would then free those prohibition legislators to maybe regulate the railroad. So you have the political bosses behind the scenes they didn't care about women's suffrage, they didn't care about prohibition, what they cared about were the railroad interests. So it's a very different political context than we were just talking about with the Civil War. The last campaign I'll talk about is the 1914 one in Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota. It was a time of optimism in the suffrage movement. National suffragists were really excited that perhaps the Northern Plains states would come in as a group. Washington state had passed suffrage in 1910, California 1911, Oregon 1912. So there was much excitement, and this was sort of a new period. In South Dakota, you had Mamie Pyle, president of the South Dakota Universal Franchise League, lead her first campaign. Anna Howard Shaw from the National American Women's Suffrage Association tour all 3 states, hoping to bring suffrage on. And then in Montana, you had Jeanette Rankin, who would eventually become the first woman to serve in Congress, leading the 1914 campaign. And just to say a little bit about her, she was born in Missoula. She graduated from University of Montana and left the state to go work in New York City, sort of become a social worker. She was a very, very a progressive woman, part of what we call the new woman. And I think this picture of her standing up with the suffrage flag in a car communicates that. She then went to New York City to get some training, and then to Washington State, and she had participated in that successful Washington State campaign before she came back to Montana. So she came back to Montana and started lobbying the legislature, first in 11, and then finally they got it on the ballot in 1914. You know, this was a time when women suffragists were starting to have street meetings, parades. They would use kind of marketing ideas to get suffrage across. But she also cared about social justice. And in her words, Jeanette Rankin's words, she said, "The women of the United States are joining in this demonstration today to show that they are ready for the next step in the evolution of democracy. While we Montana women have broader opportunities than most women of any other part of the world, we want the ballot in order to give opportunity to less fortunate women." So here's the results of the campaign. Only Montana won. It was their first vote and they won. It just took them a long time to get to the population to vote on it. Mamie Pyle and the South Dakota suffragists were just happy they only lost by 12,000 votes instead of 22,000 votes. So they thought that was progress. But the real story, again, is in North Dakota. And you see that 89,000 figure is important for what happened. North Dakota suffragists cursed their constitution, which, remember, I had said had added this little phrase about a future vote on suffrage. Well, it turns out it was a very crafty anti-suffrage limitation that really hurt the progress in North Dakota. The problem was this, I'll read this text. It said, no law extending or restricting the right of suffrage shall be enforced until adopted by a majority of the electors of the state voting at a general election. The key there, key phrases are that victory would be calculated by, quote, a majority of the electors at the general election. So not the majority of those who voted on the measure. So everyone who didn't vote on the measure was counted as a no if they voted anywhere in the election. So for example, there were 250 more votes for governor than for total votes for governor than on there were 251 more votes for suffrage than the governor. And so Elizabeth Preston Anderson's like, can you believe that more people would vote on suffrage than the governor? And 6 other measures passed with an average of 66,500. So you can see that the total votes there is way out of line. What had happened was, like I said, if you voted on any of the issues up for ballot, whether or positions from governor or any position, but didn't vote at all on suffrage, you basically, the fact that you voted at the election at all was counted as a no. So this was clearly never going to allow woman suffragists in North Dakota a victory, which is why they were happy with the 1917 partial suffrage. And I'll just say, by way of getting into a conclusion here, just to let you know that the dates and the number by which the 4 Northern Great Plains states ratified the 19th Amendment. You might have expected Wyoming to be quite early, but it's really the 27th state, and the governor only came around to handling having a special session when he heard that other states were using the lack of Wyoming's ratification as a way to say that, well, Wyoming didn't think it was a good thing for their women. So he started, when Wyoming began to be used negatively, they they called a special session. And in essence, all of these states called special sessions to ratify the 19th Amendment. Now, I'll just end by saying that, really the best times for the Northern Plains states to win suffrage were in the territorial period, when the territory could make that state, or could make that vote happen without submitting it to the people. Then when the states were creating their constitutions, they were actually in the act of talking about who could vote and creating voter qualifications, as opposed to in the East, where suffragists had to convince legislators to go back and amend their constitution. Western states were often actively creating these states. And then I think something that distinguishes the Northern Plains states is their commitment to temperance and prohibition, their large ethnic group population, and the commitment of farmers groups, which often gave women a hearing. And then finally, the widespread ownership of land is also a reason, I believe, that Western states, by women who own land, why Western states might have been more open to women and the vote. Women who owned land and proved up on homesteads suggested they were independent-minded and competent in ways that spoke to a male way of thinking about such things. So with that, I'm going to conclude and pass it over to Judge Schreier to talk in more depth about the national movement and South Dakota's movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Molly. That was a really great overview of the Plains states. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the national perspective and then particularly to South Dakota and Dakota Territory. I want you to first of all think about the hardest thing that you've ever worked on where you needed somebody else's approval to get it finished. After 5 years, you presented all the information that you knew about it and tried to persuade your supervisor, but you still hadn't gotten approval to go ahead. How do you feel? Exhausted? Ready to move on to something else? Ready to give up? Frustrated? Well, women in South Dakota worked for over 50 years and worked on 6 public statewide ballot campaigns to get the right to vote before it was finally added as an amendment to our state constitution. And I'd like to tell you their story. Before the Civil War, a few individuals began pushing for equal voting rights for women, but it wasn't until 1848 that the movement began to organize at the national level. In July of 1848, more than 300 people, mostly women, attended the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, New York. The convention was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and was attended by Frederick Douglass. A few years later, the Civil War happened. And during the Civil War, little was heard of the movement, but the Civil War ended in 1865. And then in 1868, the National Women's Suffrage Association was formed by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, with the goal of securing an amendment to the United States Constitution in favor of women's suffrage and opposing passage of the 15th Amendment that would give Black males the right to vote unless it also included female suffrage. At this time, South Dakota was not yet a state. Rather, it was part of Dakota Territory, and the territorial capital was in Yankton. The first suffrage-related bill in Dakota Territory was introduced in December of 1868. Newspaper reports said that the legislators didn't take the matter seriously, and it was defeated. Press reports actually speculated that the effort was aimed at either encouraging women to settle in Dakota or to expand the pool of people eligible to fill local government offices in the sparsely populated territory. In 1879, a second attempt was made to pass a women's suffrage bill. It passed the Territorial Council, but then failed in the House. The Yankton newspaper said that the bill's partial success was a surprise for a great many people of both sexes because they'd really viewed it as a huge joke. In 1885, Bismarck became the territorial capital, and another bill for equal suffrage was introduced. This time, suffragists had been organizing the southern part of Dakota Territory. Women filled the galleries of the House chambers to observe the proceedings. And when the measure passed both the House and the Council, the suffrage ladies almost hugged the bill's sponsor, John Pickler of Falcon, to death for the victory. Unfortunately, the recently appointed governor, Gilbert Pierce, vetoed it. The news reverberated all around the country. In 1887, another bill was introduced, but defeated by indefinite postponement. Today, they'd make a motion to defer until the 41st legislative day. When a bill was introduced in 1889 to allow women to vote in municipal elections only, the lawmakers allowed a woman to testify before the committee hearing. A very first time that a woman was allowed to testify, and then the committee killed the bill. During this time period, conventions were taking place to compose a constitution for the proposed state of South Dakota. So the suffragists worked toward the goal of having women's voting rights embedded in our first constitution. A leading proponent of this idea was Margaret Wiley Millett, the first lady of South Dakota. But even with her pushing, unfortunately, the 1889 statehood convention failed to include the women's suffrage bill in our first constitution. But they did agree to put it on the first public ballot after we became a state. South Dakota became a state on November 2nd of 1889. So the first public ballot was in November of 1890. This was the first time that voters in South Dakota would be able to vote on the suffrage issue. In October of 1889, suffragists held a convention in Huron, They organized the South Dakota Equal Suffrage Association, elected officers, and planned the start of campaign work. Emma Smith DeVoe took on the immense job of going out into the field to promote the cause and to organize local suffrage clubs. In her first county tours, she often traveled by wagon train. She faced bad roads, bad winter weather, and it's speculated even a wolf attack. She often spoke at rural schoolhouses and courthouses. One Sunday in Han County, a pastor canceled Sunday school and services to accommodate DeVoe because he fully believed that the cause that she advocated appealed so strongly to the noblest Christian sentiment of the church as to be appropriately considered on the Lord's Day. On the other hand, in Egan, the local suffrage club president resigned rather than condone a suffrage event on a Sunday, and the Moody County commissioners denied DeVoe the right to the use of the county courthouse. In May of 1890, Susan B. Anthony came to South Dakota to help with the campaign. She spoke at many locations and was the keynote speaker at an event in Wessington Springs, where banners were displayed with these slogans: taxation without representation is tyranny, equality before the law. In 37 states, the mother has no control of her child. Only idiots, paupers, criminals, insane, Chinese, and women cannot vote. The latter sentiment was not uncommon. Later that same month in Lead, DeVoe told audiences that she protested a system of government that places intelligent women on a level with idiots, lunatics, criminals, Indians, and minors. Susan B. Anthony and other national figures from the East traveled across South Dakota campaigning for women's suffrage. At one point, Anthony spoke under the cover of a lean-to canvas attached to the side of a sod church. Another time, she stood on a platform made from a barn door placed on top of boxes. She even attended the state fair that was held in Aberdeen that year and joined Governor Millett when they both advocated for women's suffrage. Most of South Dakota west of the Missouri River was still part of the Great Sioux Reservation at the time, but there were some non-Indian settlements in the Black Hills. To get there, the suffragists took a train across Nebraska and then traveled north up to the Black Hills. They traveled from Hot Springs to Spearfish, speaking in churches, homes, and halls. When Susan B. Anthony was in one Black Hill settlement, all the town halls were in use for variety shows, and none of the churches were finished yet. The Presbyterian church was the farthest along, and they let Anthony speak there after putting boards across nail kegs for seats. Throughout the spring of 1890, tensions grew between leaders of the suffrage campaign. There was both infighting among the South Dakota suffragettes and infighting between the national leaders and the South Dakota leaders. After a meeting in July in Huron, all the executive officers resigned, and new state leadership was elected. The state leadership tried to get both the Democrat and Republican state conventions to pass a resolution supporting women's suffrage, but lost at both conventions. In the last month of the 1890 campaign, national speakers Henry Blackwell, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Ann Shaw toured the state extensively. Speakers had been to Aurora County so many times that the local suffrage association president wrote to the state organization and asked if Carrie Chapman Catt's visit could be postponed because they just had 2 lectures within the previous 2 weeks. Despite this statewide effort, when the vote happened, the suffrage amendment was badly defeated by 21,600 votes. In 1893, the Suffrage Association decided to seek a more incremental suffrage amendment, granting women the right to vote on school questions only, because they thought women would have more knowledge in this area. This appeared on the ballot in November of 1894, but lost by over 5,000 votes. By 1895, the state association reported to the National Association that its membership had dwindled to 4 clubs and 35 members. The state association continued to press the legislature to put another amendment on the ballot, and finally, in 1897, they were successful. The issue was going to be on the ballot again in November of 1898. Local suffragists worked to reorganize their county associations, and they held several conventions. Some regional and national activists again came to help on the campaign, but they lost the statewide vote. The South Dakota suffragists went to the state capitol every year to try to get back on the ballot, but they were unsuccessful for 10 years until 1909. In 1909, a bill was introduced to grant suffrage only to tax-paying women who own property. It was defeated in the House. Late in the session, another bill was introduced to allow women to vote only once on the issue of prohibition. And this bill was very far down on the calendar, and it wasn't going to be heard. And then someone moved to amend it to grant full suffrage, and it passed so quickly that few knew what had happened. And then it passed the Senate, and it was on the 1910 ballot. Again, a statewide campaign started. This time, there was a distinct distancing that occurred between the suffrage movement and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Fieldwork started again with speeches at conventions, churches, schools, fairs, theaters, and chautauquas. The Socialist Party of America sent speakers to promote suffrage in South Dakota. But by the spring and summer of 1910, more infighting plagued state leadership. After a state meeting, a new executive board and President Mamie Shields Pyle were elected. But the election happened, 1910. The amendment failed at the polls by over 22,000 votes. Pyle then took the lead in lobbying the state South Dakota lawmakers for suffrage. 1911 was the first time that the legislature met in the new state capitol building in Pierre. Crowds filled the galleries for the debate in the House, but the bill was killed. In 1913, Pyle organized formal meetings with legislators in a committee room instead of trying to buttonhole unwilling men in the lobby. The Senate passed a suffrage bill by a wide majority. The House debated it for an hour and a half and then passed it, putting the bill on the November 1914 ballot. This was the 5th time it was on the ballot. Again, a statewide campaign was organized. Debates were held. The suffrage colors of purple, white, and yellow were everywhere. And that's why I have on purple, white, and yellow. National field organizer Antoinette Funk came to Huron to work with Mamie Pyle the week of the state fair. Hundreds of large yellow pennants were displayed everywhere. Visitors received ribbons and badges. Cattle and horses even wore suffrage pennants during the livestock parade. Funk gave speeches daily and preferred to speak out of doors because when she spoke in courthouses, churches, and halls, the small audiences were made up of women and men who were already supportive. The uninstructed voter would only listen when you caught him on the street. Several other national speakers also came to South Dakota that summer as part of that campaign, but it was another disappointing election in November 1914 when the amendment lost by over 12,000 votes. In 1915, Pyle decided to follow the example of Illinois and seek a bill giving women the right to vote in municipal elections. This would not need to be voted on in a public ballot. The bill went to the House without committee recommendation. One newspaper reported that a lot of mere men in Pierre waited a long time for their evening meals yesterday while their wives waited in the galleries of the House. It passed the House, but then it was defeated in the Senate. But a bill for full suffrage near the end of the session went on the public ballot in November of 1916. This time, the League organized the state into county and township leagues in the hope that every household in South Dakota would be contacted by someone committed to suffrage. They used a flying squadron where teams of speakers traveled from city to city delivering package meetings and speeches. One member played her cornet on a street corner to draw a crowd to hear the speaker. They arranged for a parade of campfire girls and Boy Scouts to lead the crowd 3 blocks to a rally in a high school auditorium. They spoke to an audience at a movie theater during the 10-minute intermission between reels. They sponsored and put on 2 plays called How the Vote Was Won and Back of the Ballot. This time, though, the opponents were more organized and visible leading up to the election than they previously had been. They traveled the state speaking and appeared at the same picture show as the suffragettes. Opponents included Germans who were afraid that if women could vote, they would prohibit the drinking and sale of alcohol. Other opponents were men who thought a woman's role was to care for them, their children, and the house. Some women opposed it because they did not want their role in society to change. After the amendment failed in November of 1916 by over 5,000 votes, Mamie Pyle and others tried again during the 1917 legislative session. They kicked the campaign off with a reception at the St. Charles Hotel in Pierre. The ballroom was decorated in yellow and purple flowers. 500 guests attended what was described as the social event of the season after the inaugural ball. When the bill came up for debate, the proponents and opponents filled both galleries. The bill passed both the House and the Senate to be on the November 1918 ballot. Before campaign work really began, though, the United States entered the war in Europe in the spring of 1917. From territorial days, immigrants who had filed their first papers declaring their intention to become United States citizens had been eligible to vote. In February of 1918, the State Council for Defense recommended that Governor Peter Norbeck work to change voter eligibility so that new immigrants would no longer be able to vote until they became naturalized citizens, out of fear that the unnaturalized male residents of German descent would be able to undermine the government through the ballot. Governor Norbeck called Mamie Pyle in March and asked her to come to Pierre. When she arrived, he suggested amending the women's suffrage ballot measure to restrict alien voting as well. She agreed. He called a special session of the legislature to vote on a new Amendment E that would define voters as full citizens regardless of sex. Many South Dakotans who would have actively joined the campaign instead dedicated their time to the Red Cross and women's committees for the Council of National Defense. Some meetings, picnics, and chautauquas were held, but World War I remained a priority. Any meetings or events had to comply with the food rationing rules of the war. Over the summer, national organizers did come to South Dakota and assisted with local and regional meetings. During the last few months before the election, the Spanish flu epidemic hit South Dakota. As a result, the League had to focus on raising awareness of Amendment E through petition drives, circulars, and posters while avoiding public meetings that were forbidden. In November of 1918, Amendment E passed with a majority of 19,716 votes. South Dakota became the 15th state to grant women the right to vote, and it was done before the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted. Amendment E not only granted women the right to vote, but also granted women the right to hold public office and to run for public office. After the amendment was passed at the state capitol in January of 1919, 2 women were sworn in as a proofreader and a bill clerk in the House. In Aberdeen, several women who had been clerks in the Brown County Courthouse were promoted to deputy officers. After Amendment E was passed, some of the local franchise leagues disbanded, others transitioned into educating new voters, and some became the core of the League of Women Voters chapters. Meanwhile, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was trying to get Congress to pass an amendment that would grant women the right to vote. The organization obtained a hearing before every Congress from 1869 to 1919, 50 years. In 1915, the amendment was voted on in the House, and it lost 174 to 204. In 1918, President Wilson became a strong supporter of the cause. Legislation was introduced, and he gave a strong pro-suffrage speech right before the House vote. It passed a 2/3 vote with 1 extra vote to spare. When it went to the Senate, President Wilson again gave a strong speech. The vote was taken, and it was 2 votes short of a 2/3 majority. In February of 1919, they tried again and lost by 1 vote in the Senate. In June of 1919, President Wilson called Congress into a special session. This time it passed the House with 42 extra votes and the Senate with 2 extra votes. When it was sent to the states for ratification, 3 states ratified it within 6 days: Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In October, Governor Norbeck announced that he would call a special session in South Dakota to vote on ratification, but only if a sufficient number of legislators pledged to attend at their own expense. Pyle and the League of Women Voters worked by telegraph and telephone to get the pledges in time. Governor Norbeck called the session, and after the required reading of the amendment, a unanimous midnight vote at 12:44 a.m. on December 4th, 1919, made South Dakota the 21st state to ratify the 19th Amendment. In August 1920, Tennessee became the 36th and final state needed to amend the U.S. Constitution. It was first applied to the presidential election in November of 1920 when Warren Harding was elected. So now that you know how hard people worked in South Dakota for 50 years, from the end of the Civil War until the end of World War I, including on 6 statewide ballot measures to get the right to vote for women, I hope that you will never forget to vote in the future in all elections. This year is the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the 19th Amendment. I encourage you to go to the Her Vote, Her Voice website and to learn more about women's pursuits of the right to vote in South Dakota. The website also gives you information about upcoming events to celebrate the 100th Amendment, including a statewide virtual toast, a lighting ceremony at Mount Rushmore where the images of significant suffragists will be displayed on the monument, and a statewide virtual event tomorrow on the day that women gain the right to vote. The website also has t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, other things for sale. Or you can sign up to be part of the Flying Squadron and host a virtual tea party, cocktail hour with your friends to celebrate women gaining the right to vote and help raise money for the South Dakota Historical Society so they can continue to document suffrage stories and archive suffrage items. You can honor a special woman in your life, like your mom, your wife, your daughter, your friend, or your coworker, with a $100 donation to the Historical Society, and their name will be placed on the honor wall. The Daughters of the American Revolution have porcelain dolls of First Lady Millette for sale to recognize her role in helping women obtain the right to vote. You can also listen to the How Radical podcast series on the Her Vote, Her Voice Facebook page during August and September, or you can register new voters or volunteer to work at the polls. The women that I told you about fought for years to get the right to vote. I hope that you exercise your right to vote, encourage others to vote, and remember to celebrate the right to vote during this centennial year. And I'd like to thank Liz Almley of the South Dakota Historical Society for her research into the women's suffrage movement in South Dakota. Her research is the basis for a lot of the information in my presentation. And also thank you to my law clerk, Hannah, who's been operating the slides for me. And both Dr. Rozum and I would be really glad to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Judge Schreier, could you have somebody, this is Lisa Marceau, could you have somebody put that last information on maybe the email that went out on the program in terms of purchasing the items and making a donation in somebody's honor to the Historical Society? The slides went by fast and I didn't quite get them.
Sure, we'll send you the website.
Thank you.
And it's just Her Vote, Her Voice, South Dakota, if you just do a general search, but we'll send you the specific website.
Okay, thank you both very much for a very informative and enjoyable presentation. There have been a few questions. I'll start with a question about World War I and how it relates to the suffrage movement. Do you think that women's participation in the war effort during World War I, while men went to fight the war, contributed to women finally getting the vote? Be interested in what each of you think.
Dr. Rosen is more of the historian than me, so I'll let her go first.
I started to talk there, but realized I was muted. So anyway, I do think that it made a difference, and certainly women felt it made a difference. Some of them were workers for the Red Cross in Europe, and they would talk about their service in the war and their service at home, doing all sorts of Red Cross work or fundraising drives, Liberty Loan drives, and argue that they were participating in this kind of national way and that they deserved the vote. And apparently many soldiers also supported women's suffrage. They saw these women, and that would be even similar to that earlier period in the Civil War years. Many women like Emma Smith DeVoe that Judge Schreier profiled, she would sing songs, and she and her husband would sing songs, and basically her husband said, these women helped us during the Civil War, fight it, we need to give them the vote. So I think there's the opportunity of showing your public service really did help the women.
And I don't really have any more to add.
Okay, thank you. I would just note for the people watching, if they have additional questions that they would like to ask, please put them in the chat window and we will be happy to pose them to Judge Schreier and Professor Rozum. There was another question that came in, and that was, especially at the beginning, there were an enormous number of costs and expenses that these activists had to cover. Were they covering those all on their own? Were there fundraising efforts to try and cover the costs of that women in South Dakota had in pursuing the vote, and also in bringing the national activists to South Dakota to speak? How was all of that paid for?
I can speak a little bit to that on several fronts. Of course, the national organization, the National American Women's Suffrage Organization, raised money, and there were quite a few wealthy women out east who contributed a lot to their stores of money, and then the national organization would give grants to different states. Of course, the women were always trying to raise money. Every time they spoke in the street, they passed the hat, they would go around to communities and explain why people should support the vote, but also ask them to contribute. And specifically for the last 1918 campaign, the way Mamie Pyle organized the finances was that each county was, based on population size, was given an appropriation or an amount that they needed to raise, and then 3/4 of that was supposed to go to the South Dakota or the state organization, and the rest in the county. And I know she was quite worried at the end of the campaign, and they were $3,000 or $4,000 in debt. I think some of the women even took loans in their names from banks in order to cover it at the end. And then with the flu epidemic, I mean, that really dashed their hopes for fundraising right at the end. They had special fundraisers going around the states helping county women, so they were very aware of their need. In 1914, they hoped to, with their suffrage newspaper, The Messenger, if they got a certain amount of subscriptions to the Messenger, they hoped to use some of that money for their campaigns. So they were constantly in search of money, and some infusion from outside organizations, but a lot of local women, and the women themselves frequently just donated their time, you know.
The other thing I would add is during the last 10 years, Mamie Pyle was really leading the fight here in South Dakota, and her husband died in his late 40s. He'd been Attorney General of South Dakota, but she was left with 3 children that she was also trying to raise and take care of. So I think money was extremely tight for her, and there's a lot of communications that go back and forth between the local entities coming back to her about fundraising and how they're doing on raising money. But I give her an incredible amount of credit that being a young widow with 3 kids that she was trying to raise and still leading this statewide organization took a lot of really incredible skills on her part. And it's just been announced that she's being inducted into the South Dakota Hall of Fame in September. So I think it really recognizes her efforts from 100 years ago.
Yeah, I wish we could interview her because, you know, that moment when she became a widow, you wonder if she understood more, you know, just all the forces that a single woman with children and how, you know, needing some of the rights and the, you know, the ability to take care of her family. You know, you wonder what she was thinking about all this, because she wasn't all that active before, you know, in the earlier phase of the movement, and maybe she was busy having children at that time, but her husband was a supporter even. So anyway, I just think she is quite a fascinating person, and it's kind of amazing that she was able to step into that leadership role. I agree with you. Definitely.
And then her daughter Gladys Pyle was the first woman elected to the U.S. House from South Dakota. So she must have really shared her passion and drive with her children too.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd like to know more also about all the daughters and sons of these suffragists that we've studied now.
Okay, we do have one more question. Well, actually, a couple more questions. Sorry. The first one is, have either of you come across any information about Matilda Jocelyn Gage, another woman, another South Dakotan who was very influential in the women's suffrage movement? And if so, could you fill us in a little, please?
Yes, she was very active in the 1880s, and particularly with the National Women's Suffrage Association before that association joined with the American Women's Suffrage Association. And of course, most of her children lived out here. She was from New York. Many of her children had homesteaded, and her son-in-law was L. Frank Baum, the author of Wizard of Oz, and just to have that kind of South Dakota connection. But she came out in the 1880s when South Dakota was debating. It had several constitutional conventions, and she spoke or rallied women to express their views to the convention, wrote letters that she published in the newspapers urging women to say, you know, we should be able to vote if we pay taxes. And I can't remember for sure, but I think maybe it was her grandfather who had participated in, you know, taxation without representation during the Revolutionary War. So she was a really good speaker, but that's sort of her connection. She had these children coming out to the Dakotas, which I assume made her want to come out here. But she was already a national figure. We kind of lost touch with her. Actually, the South Dakota Historical Society Press has a biography of her that's really well written and goes over her prominence in the National Association. She was right there with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the early years, and then sort of had some conflicts and dropped out of favorability. But she's one of the co-authors of the History of Women's Suffrage with Stanton and Anthony in the early years. She had very strong opinions on women and religion. She also did some exploration into Native American cultures, particularly in New York, and their way of organizing a gender system and the role that women would play in Native societies. So she did a lot of interesting work. And then it's nice for us, she had that South Dakota connection. I don't know if you.
Okay, Judge Schreier, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I believe we are just finished time. So I'll close the questions now. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming and participating. And as Elizabeth mentioned at the beginning, this has been recorded and it will be available for viewing later. Thank you.
Where are you going to post it?
Beth, would you like to answer that?
Sure, it will be posted to the State Bar YouTube channel and the State Bar website.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all. Goodbye.